My own family stole a multi-million-dollar inheritance from me and threw me out onto the street at 18. For 23 years, my parents and sister lived in luxury with what was mine. But the revenge I planned was so cold and ruthless that, before I tell you every detail of this story, do something quick. Subscribe to our channel. We're always searching for and sharing incredible stories here. Have you subscribed yet? Great. Thanks for being part of our community. Now, let me tell you what happened. I used to think my parents just had different ways of showing love. You know how some families work. There's always the golden child and the one who has to earn their place. I was definitely the latter. At 41, I've built a successful architectural firm in Denver, specializing in commercial developments that transform entire neighborhoods. But growing up, I was the daughter who could never do anything right. While my sister Isabel got praised for breathing, I got criticized for not breathing loud enough. My parents, Margaret and Robert Camden, made it crystal clear from day one that I was the difficult one, the one who needed to learn independence the hard way. They weren't cruel about it. They were just indifferent, like I was a houseguest who'd overstayed their welcome. When I graduated high school with honors and got into Colorado State's architecture program, there was no celebration, no proud parents posting on Facebook. Just my mother's flat voice saying, "Well, I guess you'll figure out how to pay for it yourself." Meanwhile, Isabel got a brand new BMW for her 16th birthday because she deserved something special. The contrast was so stark that neighbors used to ask me if I was adopted. I wasn't, just unlucky enough to be born to parents who apparently had a finite amount of love to give, and my sister had claimed it all. The final breaking point came 3 days after my 18th birthday. I'd been working 2 jobs to save money for college, barely sleeping, trying to prove that I was worthy of their support. That night, I came home exhausted from my shift at the diner to find my parents and Isabel in the living room, looking like they'd been waiting for me. The atmosphere was tense, uncomfortable, like when someone's about to deliver bad news. My father cleared his throat and said the words that would haunt me for the next 23 years. "Victoria, we think it's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. He handed me an envelope with $500 and continued, "This should help you get started. We've raised you to be independent, and now it's time to prove it." My mother nodded approvingly, adding, "Isabel needs our attention right now. She's more sensitive, more fragile. You're stronger than she is." I remember standing there, clutching that envelope, feeling like the floor had dropped out from under me. $500. That was their investment in my future. I'd seen them spend more than that on one of Isabel's weekend shopping trips. The message was clear. I was on my own, and I always had been. I packed my few belongings that night and left before dawn, too proud to beg and too hurt to fight. As I walked away from the house I'd grown up in, I promised myself I'd never need them for anything ever again. College was a brutal 4 years of ramen noodles, 3 jobs, and sleeping in my car between shifts. While other students partied or complained about minor inconveniences, I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries that week. The architecture program was demanding enough without the constant stress of financial insecurity, but somehow I made it work. I graduated summa cum laude, got my license, and slowly built my practice from nothing. Every small victory felt massive because I'd earned it entirely on my own. No family connections, no financial safety net, just pure determination and an almost pathological need to prove my worth. My parents didn't attend my graduation. They didn't even know when it was. Isabel had gotten engaged that same weekend, and apparently, that took precedence over their other daughter's academic achievements. I stopped expecting them to care about my life and started building one they couldn't touch. By 30, I had my own firm. By 35, we were handling million-dollar projects. By 40, I was respected in my field and financially secure beyond anything I'd dared dream as that 18-year-old girl with $500 and a broken heart. I thought I'd healed from their rejection. I thought I'd moved past the pain of being the unwanted daughter. I had no idea that the worst betrayal was yet to be discovered. During those 23 years of exile, I watched my family from a distance like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. Social media made it impossible to completely disconnect, and honestly, part of me needed to see what I was missing. What I saw confused me more than anything. My parents, who had claimed financial struggles when I needed college money, seemed to be living incredibly well. My father, who worked as a mid-level insurance adjuster, and my mother, who taught elementary school part-time, somehow afforded a lifestyle that didn't match their income. They'd moved from our modest childhood home to a sprawling house in Cherry Hills Village, one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods. Every photo showed expensive vacations, luxury cars, and designer everything. My mother wore jewelry that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and my father had developed a taste for vintage wines and golf at country clubs. But it was Isabel's life that truly baffled me. She'd married Todd Miller, who worked in middle management at a tech company, decent job, but nothing that should fund the lifestyle they flaunted online. Yet somehow, they lived like celebrities. Designer clothes, exotic vacations, a house that belonged in Architectural Digest, cars that cost more than most people's homes. The math simply didn't add up, but I told myself it wasn't my business anymore. I assumed there were rich relatives I didn't know about. Or maybe Todd had family money he kept quiet. Perhaps my parents had made smart investments or received an inheritance from some distant relative. I created elaborate explanations in my head because the alternative, that they'd been lying about their financial situation all along, was too painful to consider. When I saw photos of Isabel's elaborate wedding, the European honeymoon, the constant stream of luxury purchases, I felt that familiar sting of being the excluded daughter. But I also felt confusion. Where was all this money coming from? My parents had literally told me they couldn't afford to help with my education, yet they'd apparently funded a wedding that cost more than my first house. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I buried it deep and focused on my own life. I told myself their prosperity was none of my concern. I'd made my own way in the world, and I was proud of what I'd accomplished without their help. If they wanted to play happy family without me, that was their choice. I had clients who respected me, colleagues who valued my work, and a bank account that proved I didn't need the Camden family approval. At least, that's what I told myself every time I saw another photo of their perfect life without me in it. The irony of my chosen profession wasn't lost on me. Architecture is about building foundations, creating structures that last, designing spaces where families can thrive together. I spent my days planning homes for other people's children, offices where other people's dreams could flourish, community centers where other people's families could gather and celebrate. Meanwhile, I lived in a beautiful but empty townhouse, successful and respected, but fundamentally alone. My work was my family, my buildings were my legacy, and my reputation was my inheritance. I threw myself into every project with the intensity of someone who had nothing else to lose. Colleagues often commented on my dedication, my attention to detail, my ability to transform even the most challenging sites into something spectacular. What they didn't realize was that every building I designed was a middle finger to the family who said I'd never amount to anything. Every successful project was proof that their rejection hadn't broken me. I specialized in commercial developments partly because I loved the complexity, but mostly because I enjoyed the poetic justice of being sought after by the same type of wealthy families who'd dismissed me. Now they paid premium rates for my expertise, treating me with the respect my own family had never shown. Success, I learned, was the best revenge, or so I thought. My personal life suffered, of course. It's hard to build intimate relationships when you've been taught that love is conditional and can be withdrawn without warning. I dated, had a few serious relationships, but I always held something back. The fear of abandonment ran so deep that I sabotaged connections before they could hurt me. Friends were easier, professional relationships with clear boundaries and mutual respect. I had colleagues I genuinely cared about, clients who became friendly acquaintances, and a social circle that respected my independence. But romantic love? That required a vulnerability I couldn't afford. Every time someone got too close, I heard my parents' voices reminding me that I was too difficult, too demanding, too much work to be worth loving. So I focused on what I could control: my work, my reputation, my financial security. I told myself that success was enough, that proving my worth professionally was all the validation I needed. Some people are meant for family life, and others are meant to build empires. I was clearly in the latter category, and I'd made peace with that choice. Or at least, I thought I had, until the day I discovered that everything I believed about my life had been built on a foundation of lies. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, one of those crisp Denver days when the mountains look close enough to touch. I was reviewing plans for a mixed-use development when my assistant buzzed in with news that would ultimately unravel my entire understanding of my family. Victoria, I have someone from Hartwell and Associates online too. They say it's about the Riverside Commons project. I frowned, recognizing the name of one of Denver's most prestigious law firms, but having no idea why they'd be calling about my current development. The Riverside Commons was supposed to be a straightforward project, transforming an old industrial site near downtown into trendy retail and office space. I'd done my due diligence, researched the property history, and everything seemed clean. When I picked up the phone, the voice on the other end was professional but puzzled. Ms. Camden, this is James Hartwell. I'm calling because we've encountered an unusual situation regarding the Riverside Commons property. According to our records, there may be some complications with the title history that we need to discuss. My stomach dropped. Title complications could kill a project faster than anything else, and I'd already invested months of work into this development. What kind of complications? I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. Why, it's quite complex, and I think it would be better if we met in person. Would you be available this afternoon? The meeting at Hartwell and Associates felt like stepping into old money Denver, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound law books that probably cost more than most people's cars. James Hartwell was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer whose family name was on downtown buildings. Silver-haired, immaculately dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd never had to doubt his place in the world. He gestured for me to sit across from his mahogany desk, which was covered with documents and old property records that looked like they belonged in a museum. Ms. Camden, he began, his voice careful and measured, I need to ask you some questions about your family history, specifically, about your relationship with one Harold Camden. The name hit me like a physical blow. Harold Camden was my paternal grandfather, a man I'd barely known but had always heard described as eccentric and difficult. He'd died when I was 18, just a few months after I'd been kicked out of my family home. I remembered attending his funeral, sitting alone in the back of the church while my family grieved in the front row. He was my grandfather, I replied slowly, wondering where this was going. He passed away in 2001. Hartwell nodded and pulled out a thick folder. Yes, and according to these documents, he left you a very specific inheritance. A commercial property on the exact site where you're now planning to build Riverside Commons. The words seemed to echo in the elegant office like a stone dropped into still water. Inheritance? I'd never received any inheritance from my grandfather. My parents had handled all the estate matters, and I'd been told there was nothing left after debts and expenses. I'm sorry, I said, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. But there must be some mistake. I never inherited any property from my grandfather. Hartwell's expression grew more serious as he opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. According to these original documents from 2001, Harold Camden left his commercial property at 1847 Riverside Drive specifically to his granddaughter, Victoria Camden. The property was quite valuable even then, approximately $2.3 million. He handed me a yellowed copy of the will, and there it was in black and white, my name, clear as day, inheriting what was described as the Riverside commercial property and all associated buildings and land rights. My hands shook as I held the document. 23 years. For 23 years, I'd believed I was the granddaughter who got nothing, the one who wasn't worth remembering in anyone's will. But how is this possible? I whispered. I never knew about this. No one ever told me. That's when Hartwell showed me the second set of documents, and my world exploded into a million pieces. The forged papers were almost perfect, I had to admit. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create fake documents showing that I had voluntarily relinquished my inheritance rights to the property. The signature looked like mine. Close enough to fool a casual observer, detailed enough to pass initial legal scrutiny. But I knew it wasn't mine because I remembered exactly where I was and what I was doing in the weeks after my grandfather's death. I was working double shifts at a diner and a bookstore, sleeping in my car some nights because I couldn't afford first month's rent anywhere decent. I was surviving on pride and determination, completely unaware that I was actually the owner of a multi-million-dollar property. The interesting thing, Hartwell continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd seen too many family betrayals in his career, is that the property was sold just 6 months after your grandfather's death. The sale went through based on these relinquishment documents, and the proceeds, which by then totaled $2.8 million after some appreciate, were distributed to your parents as your grandfather's next of kin. He showed me the bank records, the transfer documents, the paper trail that painted a picture so ugly I felt physically sick. My parents had stolen my inheritance. They'd forged my signature, sold my property, and used my money to fund their lavish lifestyle for over 2 decades. The room started spinning as the implications hit me like a freight train. Every luxury vacation I'd seen in their photos, every expensive car, every piece of jewelry, every renovation to their house, the exclusive country club memberships, Isabel's elaborate wedding, her house in the hills, her designer wardrobe, all of it. All of it had been paid for with money that was rightfully mine. Money I should have received when I was 18 and desperate, working multiple jobs and eating ramen noodles for dinner. Money that could have paid for my college education, given me a foundation to build on instead of forcing me to claw my way up from nothing. I thought about all the nights I'd worked until dawn, all the times I'd chosen between textbooks and groceries, all the years I'd struggled to establish my practice while they lived like royalty on stolen wealth. Ms. Camden? Hartwell's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? I wasn't all right. I would never be all right again. But I was also something else. Something I hadn't been in 23 years of believing I was unloved and unwanted. I was furious. Not just angry. Absolutely. Completely righteously furious. They hadn't just stolen my money. They'd stolen my entire life, my sense of self-worth, my understanding of my place in the world. They'd let me believe I was worth nothing when I was actually worth millions. The legal implications were staggering, Hartwell explained with the careful precision of someone delivering devastating news. Forgery, fraud, theft, conspiracy. We were talking about serious felonies with severe consequences. The statute of limitations might have run out on some charges, but the discovery rule could reset the clock since I'd only just learned about the fraud. More importantly, there were civil remedies that could recover not just the original inheritance but decades of interest, investment returns, and punitive damages. Conservatively, Hartwell said, pulling out a calculator and running some quick numbers, you're looking at somewhere between $12 and $15 million in current value when you factor in appreciation, lost investment opportunities, and damages. $15 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. But what felt real, what burned in my chest like acid, was the realization that my family had not only stolen from me, they'd systematically excluded me from their lives while living off my money. Every family gathering I hadn't been invited to, every holiday celebration I'd spent alone, Every milestone they'd ignored, all of it funded by wealth that belonged to me. They hadn't just taken my inheritance. They'd used it to build a family life that deliberately excluded me. It was cruelty so elaborate, so calculated, that it took my breath away. Walking out of that law office, I felt like I was moving through a dream. The Denver streets looked the same, but everything had fundamentally changed. I drove around aimlessly for hours, my mind reeling with 23 years of memories that now had completely different meanings. Every struggle, every triumph, every moment of doubt about my worth, it had all been based on lies. I parked at an overlook in the foothills and stared out at the city I'd helped build, the skyline dotted with projects that bore my architectural signature. I'd created something beautiful and meaningful with my life, but I'd done it while believing I was fundamentally unwanted and unworthy of love. The truth was so much worse than abandonment. They hadn't just failed to love me. They'd actively stolen from me and used my money to create the perfect family life that I was deliberately excluded from. Sitting there as the sun set behind the mountains, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to sue them. I was going to destroy them completely, systematically, and legally. They'd taught me to be independent, to be strong, to stand on my own. Now they were going to learn exactly how well their lessons had taken. I pulled out my phone and called James Hartwell. "Mr. Hartwell, it's Victoria Camden. I want you to file suit immediately for every penny they took, every dollar of interest, and every cent of damages you can legally pursue. And I want criminal charges filed wherever possible." My voice was steady, cold, and absolutely certain. I want to take them for everything they have and everything they ever hope to have. Can you do that? His voice when he replied held a note of satisfaction that told me he'd been hoping I'd say exactly that. "Ms. Camden, it would be my absolute pleasure." The next 6 weeks were a masterclass in investigative architecture, except instead of designing buildings, I was constructing an airtight legal case that would demolish my family's house of lies. James Hartwell assembled a team that included forensic accountants, handwriting experts, and private investigators who specialized in financial fraud. Watching them work was like watching surgeons, precise, methodical, and utterly focused on exposing every hidden detail. The handwriting analysis came back first, and it was devastating in its certainty. The signature on the relinquishment documents wasn't just a forgery, it was a clumsy one. Under magnification and computer analysis, the differences were glaring. Whoever had forged my signature had tried too hard to make it perfect, creating pen strokes that were too careful, too deliberate. Real signatures have natural variations and flow patterns that are impossible to fake convincingly. In my 28 years of forensic handwriting analysis, the expert told me during her deposition, I can say with absolute certainty that Victoria Camden did not sign these documents. Furthermore, the paper and ink analysis suggests they were created several weeks after the purported signature date. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in their coffin, another brick in the wall of justice I was building around them. The financial investigation revealed a pattern of deception so elaborate, it almost impressed me with its audacity. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They'd created an entire financial ecosystem around it. The $2.8 million from the property sale had been immediately invested in a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate that had grown substantially over 23 years. But here's where it got truly diabolical. They'd been systematically transferring chunks of this wealth to Isabel and her husband through a series of gifts and loans that were never intended to be repaid. The down payment for Isabel's house? A $400,000 wedding gift from my inheritance. Todd's luxury cars, on-birthday presents that came from investments made with my money. The elaborate European vacations, the designer wardrobes, the country club memberships. All of it traced back to wealth that should have been mine. The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, laid it out for me with brutal clarity. Your family has essentially been running a money laundering operation using your stolen inheritance as the source. They've been very careful to stay just under reporting thresholds, but the pattern is unmistakable. The current value of assets traceable to my inheritance? Just over $18 million. $18 million that had been stolen from me and used to fund the family life I'd been excluded from. But the psychological cruelty was what really got to me. As Dr. Chen walked me through the financial timeline, a sickening pattern emerged. The timing of their major purchases and lifestyle upgrades corresponded almost exactly with my biggest struggles. When I was sleeping in my car during college, they bought their first luxury vacation home. When I was working 3 jobs to get my architectural practice off the ground, they joined an exclusive country club. When I finally achieved financial stability and bought my modest townhouse, they upgraded to the mansion in Cherry Hills Village. It was as if they were celebrating their theft by flaunting the very success that should have been mine. "Look at this," Dr. Chen said, pointing to a particularly damning spreadsheet. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit and you were struggling to keep your practice alive, your parents withdrew $200,000 from the inheritance investments to fund Isabel's business venture, a boutique that failed within 18 months. I remembered 2008 vividly. I'd nearly lost everything, working 18-hour days and eating crackers for dinner to save money. Meanwhile, my family was casually throwing around my money like it grew on trees. The boutique they'd funded, I'd driven past it dozens of times during its brief existence, never knowing it was my inheritance paying for my sister's designer dreams. The private investigator, a former FBI agent named Marcus Webb, uncovered details that made my blood boil. He'd interviewed former family friends, tracked down old employees at the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate, and even found the notary public who had supposedly witnessed my signature on the forged documents. The notary, now retired and suffering from dementia, had no memory of ever meeting me or witnessing any signature. More damning, Webb discovered that the notary's stamp had been used on dozens of questionable documents over the years, suggesting a pattern of fraud that went beyond just my case. "Your parents," Webb told me during one of our meetings, "weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were sophisticated criminals who'd clearly done this kind of thing before." He showed me evidence of other questionable financial transactions, other family members who'd been systematically excluded from inheritances that mysteriously ended up in my parents' accounts. My grandfather hadn't been their first victim. He'd just been their biggest score. The realization that I was part of a pattern, not just an isolated incident, somehow made it worse. They weren't desperate people who'd made one terrible mistake. They were career criminals who happened to share my DNA. The most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source, my mother's own words. Webb had obtained copies of emails and text messages between my parents and Isabel dating back several years, thanks to a court order for electronic discovery. Reading them was like having my heart surgically removed without anesthesia. "Victoria's always been too independent anyway," my mother had written to Isabel in 2019. "She doesn't need our help like you do. Besides, Harold's money was meant to keep the family together, not tear it apart." In another exchange, my father had actually joked about my struggle during the 2008 financial crisis. "Maybe we should throw Victoria a bone and hire her firm for something small," though I suppose the irony of paying her with her own money might be too much even for me. They hadn't just stolen from me, they'd mocked my struggles while living off my wealth. Isabel's responses were equally damning. "I sometimes feel guilty about the money," she'd written. "But Victoria chose to cut herself off from the family. We can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped." The gaslighting was breathtaking. They'd stolen my inheritance, used it to fund their lives, and then convinced themselves that I was the problem for being independent. They'd rewritten history so completely that they'd actually started believing their own lies. As the evidence mounted, I found myself experiencing something I'd never felt before: the absolute certainty that justice was not only possible, but inevitable. For 23 years, I'd carried the weight of believing I was unwanted, unloved, and inherently flawed. Now I understood that the flaw had never been in me. It had been in them. They were thieves who'd happened to be my parents, criminals who'd used biology as camouflage for their crimes. The power dynamic that had defined my entire life was about to be completely reversed. Instead of being the daughter who had to prove her worth, I was about to become the plaintiff who would prove their guilt. Instead of being excluded from their family wealth, I was about to claim ownership of everything they'd built with my money. The transformation was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I felt the full force of righteous anger backed by legal certainty. They'd taught me to be independent, to be strong, to fight for what I believed in. Now they were going to discover that their lessons had created exactly the kind of opponent they should have feared most, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The moment I'd been waiting for arrived on a Thursday morning in late June when James Hartwell called to tell me the lawsuit had been filed and served. "They've been notified," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Your parents and your sister have 15 days to respond, and I suspect we'll be hearing from their attorneys very soon." I was in my office reviewing plans for a new project when the call came, but I immediately canceled the rest of my day. This was the beginning of the end of 23 years of lies, and I wanted to savor every moment of their panic. The charges were comprehensive and devastating. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, unjust enrichment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We were seeking full restitution of the inheritance plus compound interest, punitive damages, and attorney fees. The total amount, $22 million. It was enough to bankrupt them completely and force them to sell everything they'd bought with my money. But more than the money, I wanted them to experience the same helplessness and fear I'd lived with for years. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to have your entire world collapse overnight. My phone started ringing within hours, but I let every call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear their explanations, their justifications, or their inevitable attempts to gaslight me into believing this was somehow my fault. The first call was from my mother, and her voicemail was exactly what I expected. A masterpiece of manipulation wrapped in false concern. "Victoria, honey, I don't understand what's happening here. There's been some terrible mistake, and we need to talk about this like a family. You know your father and I would never do anything to hurt you. Please call me back so we can clear this up." The audacity was breathtaking. Even faced with ironclad evidence of their crimes, she was still trying to play the loving mother card. The second call was from Isabel, and her message was pure panic. "Victoria, what the hell is going on? Some lawyer showed up at my house with papers saying I have to pay back millions of dollars. This is insane. You can't seriously believe Mom and Dad stole from you. Call me back right now." Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered every luxury vacation photo she'd posted, every designer outfit she'd flaunted, every expensive toy she'd bought with my inheritance money. My sympathy evaporated instantly. The third message was from my father, and his approach was different, pure intimidation disguised as parental authority. "Victoria, you're making a very serious mistake here. This lawsuit is going to tear our family apart over money that, frankly, you never needed anyway. You've done well for yourself, and we're proud of that. But this legal action is vindictive and unnecessary. Drop this nonsense before you do something you'll regret." The media attention started almost immediately, and that's when I realized how public this destruction was going to be. Denver's legal and social circles are smaller than people think, and a $22 million family fraud case involving forged inheritances was exactly the kind of story that made headlines. "Prominent Denver family accused of inheritance fraud," read the headline in the Denver Post. The article was carefully written to avoid legal liability, but it painted a clear picture of the allegations and the amounts involved. Within days, the story had been picked up by legal blogs, local TV stations, and even some national publications. My parents, a social standing in Cherry Hills Village, began crumbling immediately. Country club memberships were quietly suspended pending the outcome of the case. Friends stopped calling, and I imagined the whispered conversations at charity galas and golf tournaments. The most satisfying part was watching my family's carefully constructed image disintegrate in real time. For decades, they'd presented themselves as successful, generous pillars of the community. Now everyone knew the truth. They were common criminals who'd stolen millions from their own daughter. The irony was delicious. They'd used my money to buy their way into high society, and now the very society they'd purchased was turning its back on them. Their legal response, when it finally came, was everything I'd hoped for and more. Instead of one attorney, they'd hired an expensive team from one of Denver's white-shoe law firms, the kind of representation that costs thousands of dollars per hour and screams guilty conscience. Their strategy was predictable but telling: deny everything while simultaneously claiming that even if they had taken the money, I'd abandoned the family and therefore forfeited any right to complain. The plaintiff voluntarily estranged herself from her family at age 18, their filing read, and has shown no interest in maintaining family relationships or contributing to family welfare. Any financial arrangements made by her parents were done in good faith and with the best interests of the family unit in mind. The legal equivalent of, she was asking for it. But the best part was their desperate attempt to claim that the forged signature was somehow legitimate. They'd found a handwriting expert willing to testify that the signature could not be definitively ruled out as mine, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It was the kind of expert you hire when you're drowning and grasping for any straw that might save you. James Hartwell read their response with obvious amusement. "This is exactly what we wanted," he told me. "They're not denying they took the money. They're arguing they had a right to take it. That's an admission of everything we need to prove." The discovery phase was when things got truly ugly, and I loved every minute of it. Court-ordered depositions meant my family had to sit in conference rooms under oath, while attorneys grilled them about every detail of their financial lives. I wasn't allowed to attend, but Hartwell provided detailed summaries that read like revenge porn written by Shakespeare. My mother's deposition was apparently 6 hours of memory lapses, contradictions, and barely controlled hysteria. She claimed she couldn't remember forging my signature, couldn't recall how she'd learned about the inheritance, and had no idea where all the money they'd spent had come from. Mrs. Camden, the transcript read, "Are you seriously asking this court to believe that you've been spending millions of dollars for 23 years without knowing where it originated?" Her answer, "I trusted my husband to handle our finances. I never asked questions about money." It was pathetic and insulting, but more importantly, it was obviously false. Bank records showed she'd been actively involved in every major financial decision, signing documents and approving transfers right up until the lawsuit was filed. My father's deposition was different, pure defiance mixed with desperate justification. He actually tried to argue that stealing my inheritance had been good parenting, teaching me independence and self-reliance. "Victoria is successful today because we didn't coddle her," he'd testified. "Sometimes tough love means making hard choices for your children's own good." Even the court reporter had noted his tone as belligerent and uncooperative. But it was Isabel's deposition that finally broke my heart completely. Unlike our parents, she cracked under pressure and told the truth, all of it. Yes, she'd known the money came from my inheritance. Yes, she'd understood that I'd been cheated out of millions. And yes, she'd participated in the cover-up because Victoria had already made it clear she didn't want to be part of our family. She'd actually convinced herself that stealing from me was justified because I'd chosen independence over dependence. She never needed our help, Isabel had testified through tears. She was always stronger than me, smarter than me, more capable than me. The money let me have the life she could have built for herself anyway. The twisted logic was staggering. Because I'd been forced to become self-sufficient, She'd felt entitled to the wealth that should have made my self-sufficiency unnecessary. Because I'd succeeded despite their sabotage, she'd justified the sabotage itself. Reading her testimony, I finally understood that this wasn't just about money. It was about a family so dysfunctional that they'd convinced themselves theft was love and abandonment was protection. They'd created an elaborate mythology where I was the villain of my own story, too independent to deserve help and too successful to merit sympathy. It would have been funny if it hadn't destroyed my entire childhood and young adulthood. As I sat in my office reading the deposition transcripts, I realized that winning this lawsuit wouldn't just restore my financial inheritance. It would finally give me something I'd never had: the absolute certainty that I'd been the victim, not the problem. The settlement conference was scheduled for a gray October morning, 9 months after I'd first learned about my stolen inheritance. As I walked into the conference room at Hartwell and Associates, I felt like I was attending my own resurrection. For 23 years, I'd been the daughter who wasn't worth loving, the sister who wasn't worth including, the granddaughter who wasn't worth remembering. Today, I was about to become the plaintiff who couldn't be ignored, the victim who'd demand justice, and the heir who'd finally claim what was rightfully mine. My family was already seated when I arrived, and seeing them together felt like looking at strangers wearing familiar faces. My mother looked like she'd aged a decade in 9 months, her carefully maintained appearance cracked and worn. My father sat rigid with anger, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles bulging. Isabel looked terrified and defeated, clutching a tissue and avoiding eye contact. They'd brought their expensive legal team, but even their lawyers looked uncomfortable with the case they'd been asked to defend. James Hartwell had warned me that settlement conferences could be emotional, but nothing had prepared me for the surge of power I felt seeing my family reduced to this. They weren't the successful, superior people who'd dismissed me anymore. They were defendants in a fraud case, facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. The mediator, a retired judge named Patricia Santos, laid out the situation with brutal clarity. The evidence against my family was overwhelming and undeniable. The handwriting analysis, the financial records, the witness testimony, and their own admissions during discovery had created an airtight case for fraud and theft. "Let me be absolutely clear," Judge Santos said, looking directly at my parents. "This case will not go to trial because you cannot win. The only question is whether you want to settle now or wait for a jury to award even larger damages along with criminal referrals." She turned to their legal team. "Your clients are facing potential bankruptcy, asset forfeiture, and prison time. I strongly advise you to consider any reasonable settlement offer." The number we'd prepared was $28 million, the current value of my inheritance plus compound interest, punitive damages, and legal fees. It was enough to force them to sell everything: the house in Cherry Hills Village, the vacation properties, the luxury cars, the investment accounts, everything. They would be left with nothing except the knowledge that they'd destroyed their family for money that was never theirs to begin with. But honestly, the money wasn't what mattered most anymore. What mattered was watching them finally face consequences for 23 years of cruelty disguised as parenting. My mother was the first to break, and when she did, it was spectacular. "This is insane," she screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "Victoria, you can't seriously destroy your own family over money. We raised you, we fed you, we put a roof over your head for 18 years. Don't we deserve some consideration for that?" The entitlement was breathtaking. She wanted credit for the basic responsibilities of parenthood while simultaneously defending the theft of my inheritance. "You want consideration?" I said, my voice deadly calm. "Here's your consideration. I'm not pressing criminal charges immediately. I could have you arrested for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy right now, but I'm giving you the chance to make restitution voluntarily." Her face went white as the implications hit her. Criminal charges meant prison time, and at their age, prison time meant dying behind bars. My father tried a different approach, appealing to some imaginary sense of family loyalty that had never existed. Victoria, we may have made mistakes, but we're still your parents. Family should stick together, not tear each other apart in courtrooms. Your grandfather would be horrified to see what his money has done to our family. The hypocrisy was stunning. But my grandfather left that money to me specifically, I replied. He'd be horrified to know you stole it and used it to exclude me from the family it was supposed to support. Isabel's breakdown was different, pure terror mixed with desperate bargaining. Victoria, please, you can't take our house. Todd doesn't even know about any of this. My kids will be homeless. I'll pay you back, I swear, but please don't destroy my children's lives over something I can't change. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered every family photo I'd been excluded from, every holiday I'd spent alone, every milestone they'd ignored while living off my money. Your children will be homeless, I said quietly, but they'll still have their mother. I've been alone my entire adult life because you stole the foundation I should have built my life on. The mediator interrupted before the conversation could get more heated. Perhaps we should focus on the practical aspects of resolution, Judge Santos said. The defendants need to understand that the plaintiff's offer is actually quite generous, considering the potential criminal liability involved. She was right. We could have pushed for the full $35 million that the forensic accountants had calculated as the complete value of all assets traceable to my inheritance. We could have demanded criminal prosecution immediately. Instead, we were offering them a path to bankruptcy without prison time, as long as they admitted their crimes and made full restitution. The final settlement took 6 hours to negotiate, and watching my family's lawyers try to find loopholes was like watching someone trying to negotiate with gravity. The facts were the facts, the evidence was the evidence, and the law was the law. They'd stolen my inheritance, used it to fund their lives, and excluded me from the benefits. No amount of legal maneuvering could change those basic realities. The final agreement was comprehensive and devastating. Full restitution of $26 million, to be paid through the forced sale of all assets acquired with my inheritance money. The house in Cherry Hills Village, the vacation properties, the investment accounts, the luxury cars, even Isabel's jewelry. Everything had to go. They would be left with only the assets they could prove had been acquired through legitimate means, which amounted to my father's pension and the equity in their original modest home. Additionally, they had to sign detailed confessions admitting to the fraud, which would be held in escrow and released to prosecutors if they ever failed to comply with the settlement terms. It was financial justice with a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads permanently. As they signed the documents, I watched 23 years of lies finally collapse under the weight of truth. They'd taught me that love was conditional, that worth had to be earned, and that family was a privilege I'd forfeited. Now they were learning that theft has consequences, that lies eventually surface, and that justice is a debt that always comes due with interest. Walking out of that conference room, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete vindication. For over 2 decades, I'd carried the weight of believing I was somehow flawed, somehow unworthy of love and inclusion. Now I understood that the flaw had never been mine. They were thieves who'd stolen my inheritance and then gaslighted me into believing their theft was justified. They were narcissists who'd created an elaborate mythology where excluding me was protection and abandoning me was love. Most importantly, they were criminals who'd finally been caught and forced to face consequences. The money would be returned, of course, but more than that, the truth was finally out in the open. Everyone who'd ever wondered why I was estranged from such a lovely family now knew exactly what kind of people they really were. The settlement made headlines again, and this time the coverage was even more detailed. Denver family pays $26 million in inheritance fraud settlement, read the Denver Post headline. The article included photos of their house going up for sale, quotes from neighbors expressing shock, and speculation about criminal charges. Their social reputation was destroyed completely and permanently. But as satisfying as their public humiliation was, the real victory was personal. I'd spent my entire adult life building success while believing I was fundamentally unworthy of love. Now I knew the truth. I'd built success despite being robbed of the foundation that should have supported me. I wasn't the daughter they couldn't love. I was the daughter they'd victimized so thoroughly that I'd forgotten my own worth. 6 months later, as I wrote the last check to pay off my townhouse mortgage with money from my recovered inheritance, I reflected on the strangest twist of this entire story. The $26 million they'd stolen and I'd recovered was actually the smallest part of what they'd taken from me. The real theft had been psychological, convincing me that I was worth less than nothing when I was actually worth everything. They'd stolen my sense of family, my understanding of love, my basic trust in the people who were supposed to protect me. The money couldn't restore those things, but it had given me something just as valuable, the absolute certainty that I'd never been the problem. I was a successful architect, not because they'd abandoned me, but in spite of their sabotage. I was independent not because love was conditional, but because I'd never actually been offered love in the first place. I was strong not because I'd chosen to be alone, but because I'd survived being isolated by thieves who'd convinced me their crimes were my fault. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was proof that I'd always been worthy of more than they'd given me. As I deposited the settlement funds and watched my bank balance transform from comfortable to generational wealth, I realized that the best revenge isn't living well. The best revenge is discovering that you were living well all along, despite everything they did to prevent it. They'd taught me to be independent, and I'd learned the lesson so well that I could now afford to be completely independent of them forever. In trying to steal my future, they'd actually given me the greatest gift imaginable, the absolute certainty that I never needed them at all.